Hello, this is Professor Keith Ross from the John Jay College of Criminal Justice. This is another in a series of lectures for my college classes that I'm teaching this semester. This lecture is going to be for my corrections class, and we're going to discuss fairly briefly Chapter 8, which talks about classification and custody levels. And what we're talking about here, obviously, is inmates. I'm not going to really go over what we're going to talk about. I'm just going to get right into it. So slide number 4 on the PowerPoint presentation, the history of classification. I'm not going to really ask too many questions regarding this, but I'd like you to have an understanding because they all sort of have a similar motive. So we have McConchie's Mark system, the English Penal Servitude Act of 1853, the Elmira Reformatory, and the Wickersham Commission. Basically, what this is talking about is we want to start classifying inmates, and what we want to do is sort of observe their progress. So the way we do this, and everything that I've talked about sort of agrees, at least in theory. There are definitely nuanced differences between them, but I think for the purposes of our course, we can sort of lump them all together. And we first have segregation. Now, depending on the time period and depending on the type of inmate that we're talking about, one, we're talking about segregating these offenders, whether we're talking about detainees or convicted offenders. And I think we should really be focusing more on the convicted offenders, not really detainees. So we're going to segregate them from the general public. This is that incapacitation and deterrence, that philosophical underpinning that we've been talking about over and over again. Now comes labor, meaning we're going to make them work their debt off to society. And the better that they work, the more quote unquote marks that they earn. So they will earn marks for good behavior. When you earn marks for good behavior, you start getting more and more limited freedoms. Maybe instead of being segregated in your cell for 23 hours with just 1 hour afforded for some type of recreation and maybe showering, things like that. Well, maybe now you're allowed to maybe walk around your pod. Maybe you're allowed to join recreational activities, maybe allowed to join group activities. And once you have served your sentence, either time served, good behavior, and possibly parole, we've talked about that, or you just fully serve out your sentence, you get reintegrated into society. Modern classification systems, I jump to slide number 6. It's primarily a management tool. This is the way that we manage how we're going to deal with each inmate, because not every inmate is the same. There are going to be differing levels of security that we might have to apply. Each inmate is going to have different needs that have to be met, because constitutionally they are not subject to cruel and unusual punishment. Allocate scarce resources. Everybody likes jails up until the point that your taxes get raised because you have to pay for the jails. So there's always this pushback of dwindling resources, or can we, quote unquote, move or reallocate these resources to better ends. Like right now, today it's November 2020, and right now there is this whole sort of social construct called defund the police. By extension, I'm assuming that when we're talking about defunding police, we're also talking about defunding jails and prisons and the staff that work for them. And what the thinking is there is that instead of allocating this money for that, maybe we can allocate them for more preventative services, mental health, drug programs, etc. Not going to discuss it. It's an issue that's going to be ongoing. We want to minimize the potential for violence. So these inmates could be inmate on inmate violence. It could be inmate versus staff violence, or we want to prevent escape as well. And that could contribute to inmate violence against the general public. There needs to be an objective classification system with a standard evaluation criteria, meaning that it's not who you know. Maybe you got convicted of some offense, but a high elected official. Well, no, you shouldn't be receiving preferential treatment by who you know. You should be classified by what your needs are, what your security level is, what's your propensity for violence, things of that nature. Classification can ease overcrowding because if you are a minimally violent or nonviolent offender, well, not as much constraints will be placed upon you. There's not going to be that much staff supervision. You might be integrated into the community on a limited basis, things of that nature. Assist with the housing plans and program interventions within each jail or prison, and assign inmates to facilities based on their security level, which we've just talked about, and needs. Needs can be psychological, they can be medical, they could be drug abusers, it could be religious accommodations. There's various sort of elements that need to be considered and put into play. Number eight, the slide number 8, which is the court decisions. I'm not going to really get into it too much, but everything sort of hinges on Eighth Amendment protections, the protections against cruel and unusual punishment. And also invoked in that is the 14th Amendment, which means states must abide by the Eighth Amendment. Classification goals, and this is sort of based on that last case, Palmigiano versus Garrahy, where classification is essential to the operation of orderly and safe prisons for security, educational, and psychological needs, because classification protects the general public via escape, staff, and other inmates via violence. So we want to protect the public from victimization. We want to protect inmates from one another. We want to control inmates' behavior and maybe modify that behavior, which includes their ability to trade in contraband. Now, contraband in prisons, we haven't really gotten into it yet, could be various things. Yes, it could be weapons, it could be drugs, it could be illicit materials, pornography, things of that nature, or maybe just things that are not allowed in the prison, maybe special foods that got smuggled in. Provides planning so that agencies can better allocate these resources and determine accountabilities. So the more need that an inmate demonstrates, the more resources we have to provide. Classification aims to determine how likely an offender is to cause further injury. We've talked about that already. There are two definitions that I'd like you to know. Level of security. When we're talking about level of security, what we're talking about is the actual physical barriers that prevent escape from the jail or prison to the outside world. And custody level, which talks about the amount of staff that is going to be assigned per inmate. Now, obviously, a more violent inmate is probably going to have more staff provided to him or her, whereas maybe it really sort of depends on the resources, the money that's being paid into the correctional system, and just how these resources get allocated. But I mean, if we're talking about nonviolent offenders, let's say basically drug users, where primarily they tend to not be violent, maybe you can have anywhere from 1 to 2 correction officers to anywhere from 5 to maybe even 50 inmates. Really depends, again, on resources, where you wouldn't want to have a 1 in 50 or a 2 in 50 ratio. If we're talking about some of the most violent inmates, we're probably going to want to lower that ratio. Classification can help identify and mitigate factors that can lead to prison violence. We want to separate the predatory inmates from likely victims. Now, again, if you are violent on the outside, there really is no reason to think, unless there is a major change in personality, attitude, and perspective, that if you were violent on the outside, there's no reason to think that you won't be violent on the inside. And conversely, if you were a nonviolent offender on the outside, there's really no reason, unless there is some mitigating circumstance where this nonviolent person on the outside probably remains nonviolent on the inside. Want to separate appropriate treatment of mentally disturbed or mentally distressed inmates, inmates that require psychological or psychotropic medication. And you also want to separate, and this is a big one, especially in the big urban centers, separate rival gang members. We're not going to really talk too much about gangs in this chapter, but I mean, obviously, no one lives in a vacuum, so we're aware that there are at least two major African American gangs. One is the Bloods, one is the Crips. They very rarely, if ever, get along, and to house them in the same pod might not be beneficial. That might be a poor classification. What are we trying to do with classification? Well, we're trying to control inmate behavior. We want to give marks. Either we want to reward good behavior, meaning that the person goes to work, they follow the rules, they don't provide a problem, they don't provide any sort of conflict between staff and or other inmates, versus punishments, the people that just don't care, and whatever the rules are, they will break them. And if they break them, they probably don't even care about what the sanctions are going. Repetitive rule breakers classified as such will receive less privileges. One of the things that we have talked about previously is that there are jail industries. Let's say working in the kitchen. Working in the kitchen provides inmates with some benefits. Well, if you consistently break the rules, why would we give you such a coveted position for an inmate when clearly you can't follow rules, you can't follow direction in the basic sense? So in a more specialized sense, why would we expect that? Good behavior can earn inmates special status and less restrictive facilities. I'm going to skip to slide number 18, the process for classification. Inmates will be classified at the time of sentence, and while they're sentenced, they can be reclassified either to a lower classification, meaning less security risk, or maybe a higher classification, more of a security risk. Classification can shift through sentence based on the behavior of the offender. Slide 20 is an important slide. Security and custody issues. Inmates' initial classification is going to be based on the level of security and supervision required. Well, how do we base that? We base that on public safety concerns and also the PSI. Now, I didn't do a lecture on Chapter 5 on probation because we had a guest speaker. Maybe in the future I will do one. But I did ask you to read this, and one of the things that you learned if you read Chapter 5 is that probation officers are responsible for writing up this report called the PSI, which is the Pre-Sentencing Investigation Report. Now, this takes a whole bunch of factors into consideration. What the person was arrested and eventually convicted of. Have they been arrested and convicted in the past? What was that? What was their family life? What is their education level? Are they substance abusers? Do they have mental health issues? Do they have a support network, family and friends that truly support? Things of that nature would be included in this PSI. Institutions classify based on inmate to staff ratio, perimeter barriers, meaning physical barriers, and the means to provide security. Inmates will be assessed for programmatic needs, such as substance abuse treatment, whether maybe they do heroin, crack cocaine, things of that nature, mental health issues. Do they need psychotropic medication? And if so, what psychotropic medication? Do they need therapy? What kind of therapy? Individual therapy, group therapy, a mixture of the two, and also training needs. One of the things that I keep on coming back to in the whole of the criminal justice system and in the correctional system is that what the goal of that is that We want the person to exit the criminal justice system, exit the correctional system better than when they entered it. So if they don't have a high school diploma, well, we're going to try and provide them with one. Things of that, maybe vocational skills, HVAC, heat and air conditioning, plumbing, things of that nature. Those can be skills that you can learn on the inside and be applicable on the outside. Classification teams, each inmate is in a unit or a pod, something to that. Each unit has a classification team. So these are people that work in conjunction with other correctional staff. Maybe really what I'm talking about here is uniform or sworn personnel. So we have a unit manager. The unit manager is the one that is sort of responsible for the day-to-day operations of that unit, of that pod. The case manager is responsible for counseling and therapy. Correctional counselor, sort of intuitive, responds to the initial and ongoing needs of inmates. Educational advisor provides educational support, psychological services. Representative deals with the mental health component, mental health aspect. I'm going to jump to slide number 25, protective custody. So these are people that have been convicted of an offense, and we worry about their safety if they go into a jail or a prison, so that instead of integrating them into the GP, the general population, what we want to do is we want to segregate them, and we're segregating them for their own safety. So special provisions to provide for the safety and well-being of inmates who would be in danger in the general population. In protective custody because of sexual harassment, maybe that one. The next few are really important. Serving as an informant. Well, an informant to who? Well, probably an informant to police. And one of the things that we're going to get into in a couple of the next chapters is that you don't snitch, you don't rat. That's part of the inmate code. And if you are a police informant, by definition, what are you doing? You are informing the police of illegal behavior, probably against your own legal interests. Being in debt with other inmates, convicted of specific crimes, and really what we're talking about here is we're talking about pedophilia, sexual assault, especially sexual assault against children, or was a law enforcement officer. Slide number 27, administrative segregation, the separation of inmates from the general population due to the threat that they, the inmate, pose either to themselves, meaning that they are suicidal, staff, other inmates, or the order of the institution. Inmates receive basic necessities and visitation rights. So basic necessities, 3 hots and a cot, toilet paper, they're allowed to shower. And if you're going to shower, well, you need soap, you need a towel. Those are some of the necessities. So administrative segregation means that you are going to be segregated from general population, meaning this is sort of solitary confinement. So you receive 1 hour of recreation daily. So the other 23 hours you are segregated. No physical contact with other inmates. So that 1 hour of recreation, you're on your own. Restricted items or activities to avoid weapon construction, and you have the opportunity to get reclassified and to get reintegrated back into the general population. The last slide that I'm going to deal with is slide number 29, specialized offender categories and substance abuse. Now, this is really sort of a big to-do. Offenders have a range of needs that can affect housing decisions. Substance abuse is a big issue in the criminal justice system, on the police side, and on the corrections side. Over 83% of all state inmates and more than 73% of all federal inmates report past drug use. This can vary anywhere from habitual marijuana smoking to being addicted to harder narcotics. Drug use contributes to recidivism, meaning that the more that you use drugs, the more you're probably prone to committing crime and to getting caught for that crime. Requires screening and placement to match treatment issues with an inmate's specific needs. Now, what we're talking about here is if they're a substance abuser, maybe they can do some type of 12-step AA or NA program, where you swear off using any sort of substances, like alcohol, marijuana, harder drugs. But there's an issue here. Well, what happens if not only there are substance abuse issues, but there are also mental health issues? Mental health issues that could be corrected with psychotropic medication. Well, now there's this disconnect because we're telling you not to use drugs, but now we're prescribing you a drug to use. So you have to sort of find addiction programs that either work by themselves or work in conjunction with mental health experts that dispense psychotropic medication. I assigned a case brief to you guys, and this was sort of one of the issues in that case brief. Treatment should be based on offender specific demographics, gender, and notice they use the term gender, they don't use the term biological sex, ethnicity, language, sexual orientation, etc. That was a pretty quick chapter. Sort of the idea is that what do we want to do? We want to classify each and every inmate according to his or her own needs. If they are not a security risk, if they are not a violence risk, well, then less attention needs to be paid to them. The more riskier the inmate, the more attention, obviously, that needs to be paid. Well, that's going to be it for this lecture. I wish you all a great day and take care.